Steven Roy Goodman, host of Higher Education Today, a production of the University of the District of Columbia. Welcome back to the education program that connects you to contemporary issues, people, and institutions involved in the world of higher education. Today, we'll be talking about Korean Studies and International Relations. Dr. Frank Plantan is co-director of the International Relations Program at the University of Pennsylvania. Frank is also national president of Sigma Iota Rho, the National Honor Society for International Studies. Angela Choi is program coordinator for the Korea Studies program and the U.S. Korea Institute at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. Angela is a graduate of Wellesley College, where she helped to found the East Asian Studies student organization. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you, Steve.
Sure, well, thanks again. Angela, maybe if we could start with you, why would a student study Korean studies?
That is a very interesting question, and that's the question that I often get from prospective students. Why should students who live in the United States invest in their time, money, and effort to study this small country that's squeezed in between two giants of East Asia, Japan and China? I guess it depends on the individual and his or her professional and academic interests, but what I can say about Korea is that it's an incredibly dynamic country not only with great economic prospects and very interesting foreign relations with its neighboring East Asian countries, including North Korea, what people are most interested about, but also it's a country with rich culture, history, not to mention its beautiful language. I myself got into Korea studies because I was interested in its modern history, especially during the time of Japan's annexation of Korea.
Well, and why would a student study Korean studies then relative to international relations?
Well, Korea studies focuses on Korea entirely. I would say that studying East Asia or international relations is very important. And students who are interested in studying Korea should always start off with studying East Asian studies or international relations. But Korea is a country that has very unique aspects, and so a person who is interested in Korea should cultivate their interest in graduate school programs like SAIS to study Korea and Korea only.
Fair enough. And Frank, if we could bring you into this, at the University of Pennsylvania, you helped to run the International Relations Program.
Correct.
I assume quite a few students study Korea, but also students study other things as well.
Sure, and I want to back up for 1 second and embellish on something Angela had said. You know, my view, having been going to Korea for maybe 30 years and taking students there for 17 years, was my personal goal was always, how do you open Korea to the non-Koreans? So many of what constitutes Korean studies amounts to, in Korea, is heritage programs where they're bringing Korean Americans to Korea. And in America, frequently, Korea Studies starts as a language program, often for the local community. So my pitch, I say all that by way of background because I always tell people that Korea is the laboratory for studying anything you want to study in international relations, whether it's democracy or democratization, nuclear issues, non-proliferation. It's the last vestige of the Cold War, if it's economic development. There's not a topic in the field of IR that Korea doesn't make a really wonderful laboratory. And it was that pitch that I've often used to get non-Korean or Korean Americans interested in Korea. Now in the broader context, I think at Penn in particular, where you have very strong interdisciplinary programs, and our IR program is very, very strongly complemented by the area studies, whether it's East Asian studies, South Asian studies, Middle East studies, African studies. We have a rich heritage in area studies. And Korea now is a subset of East Asian studies, and we have a Korean studies minor. So it's a natural complement for us to have a student who does like high politics and political economy and IR, but they want to do language and culture, you know, in Korean studies. So that kind of thing is not uncommon any longer.
But Penn is a massive university in terms of the resources of Penn. Do other universities that aren't quite like Penn or quite like Hopkins have the ability to do that as well?
You see it on small scales. I think what happens, the growth of Korean studies in America was stimulated largely by funding from the Korea Foundation. For for decades, they would go and infuse money to, whether it's an art history program so that they're training curators for Korean art history, or just helping to fund the teaching of a foreign the language. And so you saw first in the smaller schools, you'll see language and culture primarily. But in larger schools like Penn, and it's Berkeley and UCLA and Chicago and Harvard and Columbia, you know, where you've got, and Johns Hopkins, of course, where there's resources to bring complementarities to bear on it. So at Penn, you know, our Korean studies people, one's a sociologist, one's a historian, there's a guy in the Wharton School of Business, there's, you know, so how you package it with the existing resources in a big university makes a difference. The small schools are going to focus largely on language and culture.
Well, and you raised the issue of resources, and that is a question I think maybe both of you could answer if you don't mind, is where does the money come from? Does it come from the Korean government? Does it come from foundations like the U.S. Korea Institute? Where does it come from?
Sure. Our Korea Studies program at SAIS is funded entirely by the U.S. Korea Institute at SAIS. U.S. Korea Institute, also known as USKI, is an independent research institute under Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. And its three main pillars are research, outreach, and education. And that education component is Korea Studies. And U.S. Korea Institute is funded by a think tank in South Korea known as Korean Institute for International Economic Policy. So when I say that Korea Studies is funded entirely by USKI, is that USKI funds students' fellowships, stipends, our monthly luncheon series, brown bag lecture series. So we thank U.S. Korea Institute for its generous fellowships.
But is there a concern on the part of folks who aren't in the field that another government is funding something at our big universities?
Like I said, it's an independent research institute. So although it is funded by the South Korean government, we set our own research agenda, and students are not affected by the South Korean government per se.
Frank, it sounded like you had something to chime in there.
Well, this is actually a very controversial issue in the history of the Korea Foundation and funding in America. Going back to pre-democratization in South Korea itself. And so there are certain purists, you might call them, like Bruce Cummings at the University of Chicago, who feels taking Korea Foundation money at different points in time is a corrupting influence. The Penn's funding, actually, there's an interesting story because it blends all these pieces together. You know, in the early 80s, when I was first studying Korea as a graduate student, the language program, Penn didn't fund. The local Korean American community raised the money to hire the Korean teacher to teach Korean at Penn. And there was, in fact, I would say, some opposition from the Chinese studies and Japanese studies people about this incursion into East Asia studies by the Korean community. But originally funded by the local community, later Korea Foundation money came in. Later in the university, it's often they're matching fund demands. Then you get alumni who make donations, prominent Korean alumni who have done well and gone back to Korea. I used to say Penn alumni were running Korea. They've made donations. So currently, the Korean Studies program at Penn's been renamed the Kim Joo-Jin Center for Korean Studies. Jim Kim was the chairman of Anam Corporation in Korea, and he's got several businesses in the United States, and he's been a trustee at Penn and a very generous donor. So we went from local community people hiring a Korean teacher to teach their own kids and Penn students Korean, to Korea Foundation money, which came in on a basis of matching funds, and then a large donation. So I don't know that that's atypical, actually. You know, And then if you've got a program as well institutionalized as SAIS, then they have these availability of other resources.
But how do you raise the issue of China and Japan? Let's say I wanted to study Chinese studies or Japanese studies. Is the funding mechanism similar?
I think it depends on every institute and every research center. So there's no one answer to that. Like Frank said, they could get funding from local communities, or they could get funding from their government of origin. So there's no one answer to that question.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, there's now the Confucian Institute sprouting up all over with Chinese government money, and that gets some of the arguments have been made against it, that sound very similar to me to the arguments made against Korea Foundation money from back in the day. So, I'm not really totally aware of those sources, but it's complex, and it's large universities have very, very sophisticated fundraising campaigns. But frequently you need an angel, a key donor who puts a big lump sum in that gets the process started. And that's, I don't think, is uncommon.
Well, in terms of going back and forth from Korea to the United States and the United States to Korea, do a lot of students study abroad in Korea from the United States, at both your institutions?
Well, yeah. So international study abroad programs, that's very common in students who study East Asia or international relations in general. SAIS is a graduate school, and so it's a little bit different from a lot of undergraduate school programs, but we do value international experience. So one of the most popular courses in Korea Studies program that we offer is called To Korea's Contemporary Research and Record, in which we take a group of students in that class to Korea for 1 week. And they meet with various policymakers, scholars, and experts to talk about their research interests. And the goal of the course is to produce a publishable paper to be published in the U.S. Korea yearbook at the end of the year. So we do value international experience very much, but because it's a graduate school program, it is different from undergraduate study programs, study abroad programs.
Yeah. Well, there's no doubt that China is the big draw today. And there have been significant inroads made. I mean, historically, in study abroad, if you look at the data, the vast majority of students go to the big three. They go to France, England, and Spain. And actually, that hasn't changed a great deal, But as far as East Asia is concerned, whereas 20 years ago students would flock to Japan, they're flocking to China now. What I have seen is students that I've taken to Korea have come back and then studied China. They did Korea, and then they were switching because they were being very driven by market and jobs and interests. And so I found that by introducing students to Korea, it introduced them to broader East Asia. In fact, when I was a grad student, we talked about strategic triangle. You had to study Korea, Japan, China. You couldn't study one by itself and make sense of what's going on there.
I think it's still true today,
yeah,
actually.
Yeah, and so I think that you see some spillover effects, but I don't see it the other way around, like students who study China and then go, oh, I want to do Korea now. It's frequently, I've noticed, you get people interested in Korea, then all of a sudden their interests get broader to broader East Asia.
Well, in terms of students going back and forth, if we can just talk about that for a second, because one of the organizations that I'm a member of, I happen to be a member of NAFSA, and I follow their stuff pretty closely. And if I understand this correctly, more women are studying abroad on an undergraduate level than men. Is that true at Penn?
They also hire academic achievers, and you've seen there have been articles, whether it's the New York Times Magazine or papers, everyone hand-wringing over what's happened to men. So I think part of it is the fact that we finally have seen 30 years worth of kind of affirmative action and trying to break down glass ceilings and create opportunities, and people are taking advantage of that today. I would think, making a gross generalization that the women are more studious than the men is tricky. Although I will say this, we give a prize out for best senior thesis every year, and we suddenly had a man win the prize after almost a decade of the women winning the best senior thesis, and we were all like celebrating. Finally, a guy won. So I'm not sure if it's tied to that whole cultural phenomena of the video games and the way people socialize is corrupted male ambition. Who knows? I couldn't say that, but it doesn't surprise me that more women are going abroad than men right now, and I just think it reflects an overall broader trend in higher education, and the fact that women now aren't confined to, as we said 50 years ago, confined to the kitchen any longer.
Well, do you ever thought or two about that, Angela? You went to a women's college, a very well-known women's college. How serious was the focus on international relations at Wellesley?
Well, very. We had very good study abroad programs, which gave a lot of students great opportunity to study abroad, easier opportunity to study abroad. For example, I studied abroad in Japan for 1 year, and it was an exchange program. So 2 women were picked from Wellesley College to go to Japan Women's University, and 2 from Japan Women's University to Wellesley College. So it was a very easy exchange, and so due to those programs that the school provided, many women were able to go and study abroad easily.
And what about internships? We're talking about studying abroad, but not everybody has the resources to do that. What are some internships that either college students or graduate students can do today that might help them get involved in Korean studies or international relations?
It's multiple. So some of our students last summer went to South Korea. Some interned at Korean Airlines. Some interned at human rights organizations and NGOs. And those they were able to secure through connections at SAIS. They would go and talk to our directors very actively. And because our directors had their own networks and their own connections in Korea, they were able to connect the students to their friends and colleagues in Korea.
And that's true for the Washington campus and the Bologna campus as well?
Korea Studies is in Washington, D.C., so it's not in Bologna. So this is only true for Washington, D.C.
So what if a student started in Bologna, but then they could take part in the courses once they got to Washington?
That is a rare case because a Korea Studies student would start usually in D.C. or in China even, but not in Bologna.
Fair enough. And Frank, in terms of the internships, what do you see your students doing?
Well, I've put students, maybe 250 students in paid internships in Korea over 17 years. It's not easy. I mean, you have to call upon, when the rest of the world doesn't have the mentality that Americans have about internships. It took 30 years, literally, in Europe before they accepted this concept of internship. And so I actually can claim that I pioneered internships both in Europe and Korea. And so you have to rely on alumni networks, like Korea, and everything, personal contact, personal relationships, draw upon it. It's easier to put students in NGOs. The NGO community in Korea is enormous. The current mayor of Seoul was a founder of one of the most powerful political NGOs, the People's Solidarity for People's Democracy. And so getting an NGO is easy. Getting paid internships is really hard. And, you know, and it requires monitoring, because often what will happen is in foreign cultures, not just Korea, elsewhere, someone will take an intern and they stick them in a corner in the morning, they don't know what to do with them. You know, they here, read this. So the key is close supervision. You almost have to train the supervisor as well. And if you do, and I can tell anecdote after anecdote of marvelous things that a Penn student intern did for different companies. You know, one found $300,000 on the books that the company didn't even know they had. Things like this.
And he got to keep half of it?
Oh yeah. They gave him a big bonus at the end of the year. But even it's hard. Internships are going global now. But I think to do it well, you have to invest in monitoring and training supervisors as well. And the other thing is I don't believe in pay to play myself. I mean, there's a lot of your audience may see offers to volunteer in Nicaragua, help work in health systems in Africa. You do, work in microfinance, and then you find out it's a tuition-based program. So you're paying to play, as I say, and I don't believe in pay to play. I think you have to work your networks. It takes time, it's hard. Think tanks is another area that's a possibility. Very hard to get undergraduates into think tanks. We've had a lot of success with it, but they usually want graduate students. And even it's a challenge, but I think you must do it. The best abroad experience is credits, resume item from internship, and that culture, social travel piece together is, I think, the magic of study abroad.
Well, fair enough. But what if a student doesn't have that ability? What if a student is not at a place like Penn or doesn't have those resources? Do you still object to them going to one of those programs that would help them get to Nicaragua, for instance?
I think, in American higher education, even community colleges today now have international programs offices. They're sending students abroad. I think the globalization dynamic that took off in the early 90s, mid-90s, to today has just transformed how people think about the world, not just the world, but their opportunities to work or get jobs. And I've seen, again, open the Chronicle of Higher Education, you see community colleges with international program directors. So I think you see it. I went to Illinois State University as an undergraduate, and I went to a summer program in Japan. I had to borrow $2,500 to do it. At the time, it was like, I didn't. But, it transformed, changed my life. And I think I will argue to students that even if they have to borrow, it's worth getting abroad, because the return on that investment's a lot greater than you might get in other things you can do locally.
Well, speaking of locally, though, and we only have a few minutes left, but in terms of jobs, what jobs do SAIS graduates tend to take in Washington and the United States generally?
I said Penn students run Korea, SAIS grads run Washington Foreign Policy Establishment.
That's right. Well, our Korea Studies students go into broad different sectors. Many go into government. Some of our alums work for the Department of Energy, State Department. Some go into private sector, consulting firms like Booz Allen. And some pursue PhD and further, like higher education and academia.
And what about on the Penn side, on Penn undergraduates? Where do you find most of Penn graduates, besides me?
You might remember, Steve, that Penn's really pre-professional. We have a lot of professional schools, and including Wharton. So the the influence of that on undergraduate options, it skews it. So in IR majors, literally do go, consulting's the biggest draw, banking's there. Of course, NGO, international organizations, government service work. In the last, since 9/11, Intel has been a big growth field. Students go into intelligence frequently. But we still have students who want to teach. They want to do English. They teach English abroad. The KIPP Academies in the United States were founded by an IR grad. He did Teach for America, and now he runs one of the great powerhouse charter school systems in the country for poor and underprivileged children. So I always tell people IR is at first a liberal arts major, and so the training, if you may not work in a career in international affairs, but your preparation for the current job market's there because of the foundation in liberal arts that we provide.
And I, look, as you both know, I've been very supportive of international relations for many, many years. But I often wonder about the average American voter, and it's an election year, and who doesn't really think about international relations until something's on the front page of their newspaper or blinking out off their computer screen. And why should we invest all these resources in international relations if the average American isn't really paying attention?
Do you want to tackle that question first?
No. That's very tricky because, I mean, we don't go into this as evangelists. I happen to think, I support the the Great Decisions Program, the Foreign Policy Association, that does a lot of community education where people sit down in groups and they discuss the issues of the day. You know, not enough of that goes on. Our secondary schools are challenged just to meet all the requirements to graduate today. There has been an increase in the study of world history and global issues and world economy. I've seen it, but it's competing against all these other demands. So trying to get, you know, I don't expect everyone to be interested in IR, just like an engineering professor can't expect everyone to, why don't you know more about solar energy? But I think, you know, the good thing is that the globalization dynamic has made people aware. You know, we know what maquiladoras are in Mexico now. We understand when you complain about outsourcing, the people know more about China. You know, for years I used to say people always thought the Chinese were a bunch of people with coolie hats in rice fields, and I'm going, you better go to China because they're going to run right by us here real soon. And so, you know, I think changing people's perceptions of the world is critical. I think it is part of our mission. I said we can't be evangelists, so I feel I am. I believe in the work a great deal, and I like to see it trickle down more. But I don't know how we correct misperceptions in the world. Sometimes it takes having your son go off to war and not come home to make you aware what's going on in the world.
Fair enough. Angela, last word. We've got about 30 seconds.
Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, just adding to that, the popularity of Korea studies at SAIS, just looking at our program, it has grown tremendously over the past years since our foundation 5 years ago. We started out with less than 3 students, and now we have like 17 Korea studies students. So that's a dramatic growth, and a lot more people pay attention to Korea, which 10 years ago was, there was no attention. So that's what I have to add to Frank's comment.
Well, that was terrific. Thank you both. If you would like additional information about Frank Plantan or Angela Choi, please visit sas.upenn.edu/IRP or uskoreainstitute.org. If you have comments or suggestions about higher education today, please send an email to our viewer mailbox at highereducationtoday@topcolleges.com. Thank you for watching. We will continue to bring you quality discussions about important matters in today's college and university world. Please join me again for another edition of Higher Education Today. I'm Steven Roy Goodman, and you've been watching Higher Education Today.